Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leaderships, our Washington Leadership Program. My name is Nisha Karani, and I am on the Board of Directors for CAPAL. The Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, or CAPAL, is a nonprofit organization that builds Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander AANHPI public service leaders by providing formative professional experiences and growth opportunities. It is my pleasure to be introducing and to be working on the second of our series of the Washington Leadership Program with you all today. The Washington Leadership Program is one of our signature programs, and it introduces students to AANHPI leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. Our WLP theme this year is reflection and resiliency, emphasizing the ability of communities to come together and catalyze momentous change through these unforeseen times. Through these sessions, panelists and attendees will reflect upon events leading up to 2021 and emphasizing how communities unite, reflect, and demonstrate unyielding tenacity and resilience, even in the face of uncertain and demanding circumstances, as we've experienced in the past year, but also in the past 4 years. All WLP sessions will be recorded and live streamed to our Facebook page and will be available for later viewing afterward, including all materials. So I would like to welcome you to today's session from niche demographic to defined swing voters. The AANHPI community played a key role in the 2020 election, particularly in swing states and counties. In this session, we will discuss the growing power and voice of the AANHPI community in politics. We will dive into understanding historic and current AANHPI voter participation and voter engagement and mobilization. Key takeaways from this session can include avenues in which to get involved in elections and grassroots organizing, as well as public service. Follow and join our conversation tonight on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCAPAL and tag us at CAPALDC. So there will also be a short survey. I just want to mention there will be a short survey that will pop up after we close this session. And we really encourage you to participate in the survey. It's going to really inform, our session and our series going forward. And we appreciate all feedback. So with that said, I would like to begin by thanking our speakers and panelists this evening for spending their time with us. And to you all for joining in. Of course, a very special thank you to our 2021 sponsors for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Tonight's program will consist of an audience poll, a panel discussion, and Q&A. Please submit any questions you have into the Q&A box, and we will close out afterwards. So now I'm pleased to introduce Christine Chen to set the stage for our panel with an audience poll. To give you a little bit of background, Christine Chen is a co-founder and executive director of Asian Pacific Islander American Vote, APIA Vote, one of the most trusted national nonpartisan organizations. APIA Vote's mission is to work with local and state community-based organizations to mobilize Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in electoral and civic engagement. Christine has been a champion for the empowerment of AAPI communities from the start of her career. Moving to Washington, D.C. from Ohio, she took on organizing and leadership roles at the Organization of Chinese Americans, OCA, and started a consulting firm, Strategic Alliances USA, which was built on her broad and deep pool of relationships and skills in the AAPI community and in government. And while serving as executive director of OCA National from 2001 to 2006, Christine Chen served as a member of the executive committee of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She's a founding member of APIA Scholars and served on numerous boards, including the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and Demos Board of Trustees. She currently serves on the Kennedy Center Community Advisory Board and the Center for Asian American Media. And so with that, I'll hand it up to Christine to get the Zoom poll started.
Great. Thank you, Nisha. And thank you, Hannah, who's behind the scenes, who's going to go ahead and launch our poll. We want to make sure that we got a chance to get to know each and every one of you. And these are many times the similar questions that we were asking of the AAPI electorate during the election cycle. So everyone, if you can, go ahead and take the time to answer these 5 questions. The first one is about, we just also want to get a sense of who was able to vote, and if they did, how so. Also, the second question is more about how we engage in elections and politics and how we communicated that during the 2020 cycle. Also, what has been the experience that you think of using language assistance in voting? And then also reflecting back in terms of party identification and outreach, and also what issues may have motivated you to tune into the elections. So Hannah, since I'm gonna leave it up to you, when you see that a large majority of participants have answered it, then you could go ahead and share the results. I think we have maybe 1 more minute, pretty close. For anyone that has completed the poll, if you also get a chance, feel free to put into your chat your name, your pronouns, and what school you're from, and maybe even share like where you may be interning. We try to do what we can to really get to know everyone, so that way we can make sure that the discussion really is applicable to what your needs are and that you're able to participate as well. Great. Looks like Hannah's closing the poll. Wonderful. Okay, so the first question for the election day cycle, it looks like voting by sending in the mail-in ballot was at 63% and voting on election day at 34%. So this is actually quite similar to what we saw as the national trend. 73% of all Asian voters voted by mail or early voted. So it's really great to see that the demographics and data that we're seeing is actually quite similar to what we're seeing here today. So the other question is, did you discuss the elections or politics? Primarily, it looked like Instagram, which I think, assuming that a large bulk of those attending are interns and college students, that would match the demographics, followed by Facebook and Twitter. But it does look like there are some folks that did also engage a little bit on WeChat and WhatsApp, and a little bit lower online. No, surprisingly, no one on CAPAL. In 2020, how many Asian Americans use language assistance to vote if available? So the answer that everyone thought was 1 in 5, in reality, it was like 1 in 3. And so that was based off of the 2020 Asian American Voter Survey that API Votes conducted with Asian American Advancing Justice AJC and API data. So what we typically are trying to advocate with our local jurisdictions and with elected officials and campaigns is that there is still a segment of voters that really prefer language assistance and to have materials available. And so that's why we are always trying to reflect and obtain that data to be able to share that. Fourth question, reflecting back on the elections, do you remember you or your family being contacted either by the Democrat, Republican, or community organizations? This really hearts me. I'm so excited that 77% said that they were contacted by the community organizations and closely with the Democratic Party. And this is actually the trend that we also saw in the national surveys and post-election surveys as well. So we're really excited that the work of the community continues to do well, and that we're making headway in terms of getting the parties to also do some more outreach. And then lastly, note which issues motivated you to tune into the elections. So it looks like the number 1 issue for this cohort is racism and racial discrimination. And then also education and environment also came in very closely. What we also saw in some of the voter surveys that were conducted this past year is that especially women, they noted racism and racial discrimination as one of the major driving forces for them to also come out. That was actually something that's a little bit between men and women voters as well. So this is really exciting to see. I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll. Hopefully we've learned a little bit in terms of like who is here with us today. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel that we have joining us. I will say that you are in for a treat because all these women are powerhouses in themselves. They have such a great history in terms of working in the community, working in politics, working as public servants. And really, if you guys all get the chance, I would encourage you to really dig in a little bit deeper and try to have conversations and learn from each and every one of them. So our first panelist is Chantel Wong. She is the CAPAL founder and current chair of the Advisory Council. Chantel is the whole reason why we are here today. Without her vision for CAPAL, I know even for myself, I came through Washington, D.C. as an intern, then a staff at OCA, and then later on essentially established my career here. But Chantel is, like I said, the founder of CAPAL. She has volunteered in every presidential campaign since President Bill Clinton and many congressional, state, and local races. She is a board member of several nonprofit organizations, including Focus on the Story, an organization dedicated to supporting and encouraging photographers of diverse backgrounds to explore the power of visual storytelling to spark social change. She retired after 23 years and has begun a new journey as a photographer. What the bio doesn't say is that she has also served as a political appointee as well as career service in the federal government. So she really understands the ins and outs of Washington, D.C. and establishing a career. Lynn Nguyen has extensive political campaign experience. She's the executive director for Run AAPI, she also specializes in outreach strategies to young voters, Asian Pacific Islanders, and communities of color, while working for a number of candidates across the country. She spent the 2020 presidential year with Senator Cory Booker as his director of coalitions and was the political director for the New Campaign, a creative collaboration between Run API and Mina Harris's Phenomenal Women. Currently, Lynn consults on API engagement in disaster relief and public health emergencies with Governor Newsom's Office of Emergency Services and is the executive director of Run AAPI. Our next panelist is Vianti, who's the organizing director for the Asian American Advocacy Fund. As a graduate of Georgia State University in economics, Vianti Joseph is a longtime community organizer and advocate for immigrant and human rights in Georgia. She had a professional career in business intelligence and program management before moving into social advocacy spaces. She is a co-founder of They See Blue, Georgia, an organization that aims to educate and mobilize South Asian voters. In 2020, Vianti served as the AAPI constituency director for Senator Warnock's campaign and the Georgia AAPI Advisory Council for Biden-Harris. Vianti recently joined the Asian American Advocacy Fund as their organizing director. And then lastly, we have Grace Choi, who's the Director of Policy, New York City's Mayor's Office. She's the Director of Policy. In that role, recently she served as a constituency director for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders outreach for the Stacey Abrams for Governor campaign. She is a Council on Foreign Relations team member, is a Council of Korean Americans member, was a member of White House National Security Leadership Workshop, and served on the Conference of Asian Pacific American Leadership Board of Directors as Vice Chair for Programs. So thank you, ladies, for joining us today. And before we go ahead and get started, what I would like to go ahead and do is to share my screen and with just to level set and present a few data points with each and every one of you. Can everyone see that? I guess so. If everyone could have a verbal cue. Great. So just to make sure that we all understand what we're in, where are some of the growing trends in the API electorate, we also want to make sure that everyone understands what is the API community. Currently, right now, it does encompass over 22 million Asian Americans and 1.4 million Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. And from time to time, I will go ahead and utilize the term AAPI, or I may just specifically say Asian American, or I will say Pacific Islander. Depending on what data is provided to each and every one of us will determine the terminology. But that essentially also encompasses over 50 ethnic groups and over 100 languages. And we have over 60% of this community are also foreign born as first generation immigrants. The most recent data is showing that the last 9 years, we've seen double digits of growth in the API population in every single state except for Hawaii. And on the right-hand side, you'll also see the most recent trend of which states will be losing a congressional seat and which one will be gaining them. But in particularly the ones in green, where I would point out like Oregon, Colorado, Texas, North Carolina, Florida, these are all areas where we're seeing growth within the API community as well. Yet at the same time, we are still missing many times from the narrative. It's only in this last 18 months that we've seen from studies like this that lawmakers are mentioning Asian Americans on social media. And a lot of it has been because of the increase of violence and anti-Asian hate that we've seen in the last 18 months. Also with the Invisible Ink report produced by APIP and Asian American Journalists Association, we also see that even when there is data, many times they're choosing to not use that information. If you take a look at the bottom, it says 37.4% are typically excluded even when that data is available. Also on the right-hand side, you see that less than 4% of articles will focus on APIs when they did a scan in terms of looking at articles on economic inequality, articles on the API community in itself. So many times, because we're missing from the narrative, we're also stuck with the certain stereotypes that we're seeing, especially in terms of the model minority myth. And here we see with the Pew report that there really is truly diversity in terms of median household income really varies among the Asian origin groups. So it's really important that we continue, as our population grows, that we really need to continue to change the narrative in itself. As part of that, 2020 was a significant year. It really was heading into that. Even before the pandemic, we knew it was going to be a challenging year because once every 20 years is when you have the census happening at the same time as a presidential primary. And with that, but with the growth of our community, we have shown that with other communities, we are really changing the political landscape. Here we see are highlighted our major battleground states during the 2020 election cycle, and how close what the margin of victory was, and what the number of APIs who voted in the 2020 cycle looked like. I also want to show you the trends from where we stand. Even before the 2020 elections, I used to say half of our community, you might as well assume that only half are ready to go vote. The other half have chosen not to register and participate. Because for the longest time, since 2004 and really 2008 to 2016, it really maintained around that 55 to 56% of our community was registered. I'm really excited to see and report out that in 2020, it's really increased to almost 64%. And our turnout was one of the largest in comparison to other communities of color by a 10-point difference from 2016 to 2020. What you'll hear later on is about how we overperformed, especially in places like Georgia, not only for the general election, but also for the runoffs in itself. So this is something that we've seen. Here's a graph in terms of comparing ourselves with other communities. But the challenge now is that we have a lot of new voters that entered into the cycle in 2020. And so we need to go ahead and try to get them to vote 2 more times. So because studies have shown that if you get a voter to vote 3 times in a row, they're more likely to be a lifetime voter in itself. And then one other thing I wanted to go ahead and note from the National APA Women's Forum, 1 in 6 API women voted for the first time in November, and even more so in Texas. Among multilingual women and low-income women, especially, the vast majority of API women voted either early by mail or in person in Texas. Also, in terms of youth, wanted to make sure that we understand what the median age of the Asian American community looks like. The youngest cohort really comes from the Hmong community, but they continue to be more civically engaged. We've seen this turnaround in 2018. Versus in the past, we used to note that AAPI youth used to have the lowest participation rate, but now we're seeing this uptick, and this is actually continues to change. We saw this from 2016 to 2020, where voter turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds were 38% to almost 56%. So that's amazing. So now we just got to get everyone to turn out 2 more times at minimum, right? Recently, the US Census did come out with their analysis of the elections through their current population survey. We want to demonstrate that Asian Americans are actually less likely to register to vote at the DMV or at the registration office. So that's why we're always saying that we really have to depend on the community to do that one-on-one engagement, to be out in the community where they're located and convening and interacting with one another to talk about the elections and to get them registered. We also noted earlier that 73% of Asian Americans voters cast their ballot by mail in 2020. That's the largest in any other community. And then the number one reason still why Asian Americans don't vote is because they're more likely to say that we are still too busy to vote. And this has been the case since 2012 when we've been looking at this data. And that's why heading into the pandemic, we felt like we were in a better position to get people to be able to take advantage of early vote and mail-in ballots, because we've been trying to educate these options for the past decade in itself. And then, so this will provide you a general idea in terms of level setting, in terms of what has been presented. And so right now, I just want to go ahead and turn the conversation over to our panel and to really get your reactions in terms of what was presented in the data, and does that really correspond to your experience on the ground? So why don't we go ahead and start with maybe some of the folks that were working in Georgia. I know a large bulk of you did that, but maybe Lynn or Vianti could kick it off.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, everybody, Bianti Joseph, like we said, I just want to make the clarification that when I talk about my work on the campaign last year, that is before I started with Asian American Advocacy Fund. And that was work on the Warnock campaign that is separate from what I am doing now. So just legal disclaimers. But yeah, so in Georgia, those numbers are really, we outperform those numbers, as you said, right? In Georgia, what we were able to see was really a major, so much of our registered voters showed up. In the general, 61% AAPI registered voters voted and 51% in the runoff. Some of the other things that were really key is that from 2016 to 2020, 2016 to 2018, turnout was about the same, right? In terms of a percentage, but it really went up in 2020. Our population went up, and then turnout almost doubled. The number of people who APIs that voted in the 2016 general versus the 2020 almost doubled. And just imagine that, right? We had a 1 point, we went from 3% to 4.5% population increase, but doubled the number of votes. And that really, really made a difference. It's, just one of those things where all the outreach really made a difference. Yeah, one of the other big numbers that I think is key to what happened in Georgia was elections to runoff. Usually we see a huge drop off, right? From the general, people don't want to show back up to vote. It's cold. It's, they've just done this. But in the runoff, there was an 85% retention rate, which is huge. And we'll talk a lot more, about why that happened. But just in terms of the numbers, yeah, it's amazing.
So Lynn, you also was key in working on the campaign in Georgia, and you've also worked several election cycles. So what are some of your observations in terms of what happened in Georgia as well as other parts of the country? Is that also, has that changed the narrative in terms of how we talk about the API electorate? And has that really changed because also about building more effective coalitions and solidarity between the
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So again, everyone, my name is Lynn, pronoun she, her. One thing I also want everyone watching to know is that this panel here, we all know each other so well. We've either worked together, we've organized alongside one another. All of us were in Georgia at some point with Grace calling Georgia home. And so it's just, it's a very special moment for all of us to come and like reflect on what's been happening for our communities in the rise in Asian electoral power. It's so interesting that we reflect on this specifically, Christine, and a lot of us know this who've done this work, but it has taken us a very, very long time to get to this moment, right? And I want to say us specifically on the campaign side, right? So a lot of us we usually don't have an AAPI outreach director, or we don't really have a budget to work with, or like the one token person that's hired to do the job of 10 different people and communicate. And we all know how complex our community is and how diverse our community is. And so I think it's interesting in that I truly feel that campaigns and candidates for both parties, they're really starting to take their time with their hiring process and practices, and understanding that, okay, when we're thinking of the AANHPI communities, it can't just be one person who really only reflects the Southeast Asian community, but we really need to build some kind of internal infrastructure that can really absorb what the needs are. And so I've started to see that shift quite a bit. And actually we saw it on the ground in Georgia, most recently in the runoff elections, where I was working closely alongside Bianti, but more with the Democratic Party of Georgia as their AAPI coalitions director. But we had really unique representation from a number of different communities and in different roles, right? It wasn't just outreach, but it was comms, it was press, it was digital, it was organizing. And we saw that reflected on the community and movement side as well. And so again, it's the internal infrastructure is changing. It's taken us a while to kind of get here, but it's also reflecting on, you know, the results that we're seeing on election day. You know, so I think the last thing I'll say on this, and I know we're going to dig deeper into this, but, you know, I truly believe that the electoral organizing side, you know, folks are understanding that to engage with us, it's going to be more than, you know, bringing your candidate to have boba, you know, for the first time, or it's really going to be more than having our campaign materials translated in 5 different languages. You know, we got to think meaningfully with how we're doing this work and what the long game is.
Well, sticking with Georgia, since Grace, you're from Georgia, you know, as Lynn said, this didn't happen overnight on the campaign side, but we also know the community had to also build its infrastructure and build its capacity to also do this work. And I'm always telling everyone what the numbers that we saw coming out of 2020 didn't happen overnight, because there's been a long-standing lot of building and work that was done. So reflecting back at different campaigns throughout the cycles, and also, you know, Georgia had elections every single year because of the runoffs and also special elections. You know, what are some of your observations about the voting patterns of this community?
Yeah, so good to be with everyone. I agree with Liz. We're all friends with to come together again, and yeah, and it's also really special because I used to be a CAPAL board member and was the vice chair program, so ran the Washington Leadership Program like a while ago. And Carmen Chow, who was an intern, I think, at the time when I was a board member, is the one who asked me to join this. And I was like, of course, I miss Washington Leadership Program. And so I'm glad. I guess one of the gifts of COVID is that we can use our virtual Zoom to bring people from across the country to be together, because typically it was all in person in DC, right, on Capitol Hill at the CBC auditorium. So anyways, good to see y'all and people on the chat. Welcome, all interns. I'm sure you all are expecting something different, but hopefully with vaccinations, things will slowly change and it'll be a really meaningful experience for you this summer. In terms of the changes that I've seen, I mean, my first presidential election was in 2008 for Obama. It was right out of college, and I was living in New York City, actually, where I am right now. And I would go canvass on the weekends in Philly. I remember, I mean, Christine and Chantel, y'all have been doing this for many more cycles, but even back then when there's a lot of AAPIs in New York City, there weren't many AAPIs engaged in the presidential election to go to a swing state. All the volunteers around me were not AAPI, or very few people, persons of color too, even though it was Obama who was running. In 2012, when a lot of the AAPI national affinity groups for Obama formed up and now are actually established PACs. So at the time, I was part of Korean Americans for Obama, and I had never heard of any national infrastructure to engage our community. Of course, it's all volunteer and no money, no funding, but you know, a lot of people who care about the community, much like Chantel, who founded CAPAL and were, you know, volunteers, and then now it's an established nonprofit with staff. I think we've come a long way, even from 2008 to 2012 to 2016 with Hillary's campaign for presidency, and then 2020. in terms of what Lynn was talking about with the pipeline of political organizing. And I think I think that also is a contribution to the voter turnout. And I have to say, organizations like Christine, API Vote, who have been around for a very long time. I remember I was an intern in 2004 in DC when I heard of API Vote, and that's what got me really excited about, organizing my community to vote on my college campus. In Georgia as well, there has been an infrastructure of C3s that have been doing the groundwork of voter registration, voter turnout, voter education. But what was new and different in Ossoff's congressional race in the special election in 2017 and into 2018 for Stacey Abrams' election for gubernatorial race was that the Democratic Party of Georgia, the state party, had never had an AAPI outreach director until they hired me. And it's because of, I think, when you have candidates who care about coalition building, much like Senator Cory Booker, who hired Lynn, and then Stacey, who hired a coalitions and political team that was more diverse than Obama's or Hillary's presidential campaign in terms of like all the different constituency outreach. I think people are learning more and more how important that is. And so what the C3s did in Georgia, including like CPACs, the Center for Pacific American, Asian American Community Services, and Asian American Advancing Justice, Atlanta, these C3s, I mean, they've done incredible work. And I think what was exciting was trying to get people to get comfortable with doing partisan politics in Georgia, where it was not blue yet, and it was purple-ish, but like more reddish purple, even in 2018. And I think it's just really exciting because more and more of us who are former volunteers, who became campaign staff, who are now campaign operatives and political operatives, have like gone into these like political and civic engagement infrastructures in the C3 side, the PAC and campaigns. And so you're seeing a more effective way for people in our community to be turned out, to come out to vote. And what Vianti was sharing with the turnout from the presidential cycle from 2016 to 2020, it's really because of the ground game of the C3s, and then more campaigns investing the money and infrastructure in, including, our Congress members in DC, Grace May and Judy Chu, who put money into Georgia as well through their leadership. That's how we got more funding for outreach. I had a point I was going to end on, I can't remember anymore. But all that to say, we've come a long way, and it's really a partnership of C3s, PACs, and campaign. And then the people on the ground, the constituents being like, enough is enough. We want to be heard and seen. And unfortunately, as Lynn mentioned, the violence is like, we've had enough of being invisibilized and silenced. Like, we are going to run, we are going to work on these campaigns, and we are going to be heard and seen. And so it's just like a very exciting time for our community.
Wonderful. Thanks, Grace, especially all that insight. But Chantel, you've worked a number of cycles, and you've also traveled across the country. Can you talk a little bit about the states that you visited and worked in, and some of the commonalities and differences that you've observed? Oh, if you could unmute yourself.
I'm on mute. Yeah, I second what everybody else is saying about really being friends, and this is how we fall really in arms and battle, right? In all of these campaigns that we've done. So yeah, it's been very interesting over the cycles and over the years. We've gone into battleground places where, as Grace mentioned, it's not quite blue yet. It's not quite even purple. It's red. And I do remember, going back to Georgia, the 2017 was when we looked at the demographics and the voter register voters. This is API Victory Fund was looking at the data at the time, and we thought, oh my God, there's 10% of that congressional district are Asian Americans. We don't know if they're Republicans or Democrats. And in fact, when we went in there in 2017, it's probably 50-50. And we went in to help Ossoff, basically, right? And what I've discovered in many of the places that I've gone to, there's always sort of like a person, I call him him or her, the Paul Revere of that organization, of the community. So in Georgia, it was Lonnie Wong. You know, I ended up staying in Lonnie Wong's house. We went down there and had organized, I think it was 6 different meetings, because Asian American community is so diverse. You know, we had to go into the Filipino community, and then the Southeast Asian community, then the Korean American community, all different groups. I brought in Shaker to meet with the Indians, and I brought in Loida to meet with the Filipinos. So we kind of covered the ground in 2017. And that was the case in 2016 when I went to Upper Darby in Pennsylvania. We had a particular person who had everybody's number on his WhatsApp, and he was my go-to person. You know, getting out the community, getting out the vote. He knew exactly which precincts that they've actually been working on the ground, which precincts to go to, where our community is, and then the Bangladeshi community down in Upper Darby, they were all taxi cab drivers. And I think we met them all in New York this weekend, the Bangladeshi, because Senator Rahman, he's kind of the Bangladeshi across the country. We brought him into New York, and he attracted everybody. Like, we're standing in the street corner in New York down. So that's how it all happened. It's really the person building communities, but also in these battleground states, it is really what Georgia is the perfect example. It's the groundswell of the communities and organizing, the C4s, the C3s, all being part of that infrastructure. We started out the 2 Obama cycles in Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area. That also was very much a Filipino American community. We went in there and helped them. And they basically told us, you can't come in every 4 years and think that this is it. So we got to put in that effort and build that coalition and build that community support. And so this cycle, the presidential cycle, and Christine, you talked about the battleground states. We all kind of like those of us that have been old hands at this, trying to figure out which state should we all kind of cover. And there were, you know, Francie and Erica, they were covering the North Carolina. I got assigned Arizona. So, you know, Arizona, we've never really gone out there. Arizona is kind of like virgin territory. So I went and met with you know, some of the Asian American groups in Arizona. Arizona is a little bit different than the other states, but you know, we're trying to build that sort of that what I talked about, that community. But in Virginia, we've got it now. You know, in Georgia, you guys are doing great, and then Pennsylvania, we got to keep at it. And I think Nevada was the other state that we've put in at least 10 years, a decade of organizing, community organizing, and still needs a lot of work. So that's kind of been my experience. It's been great. It's been very much hard work on the ground. As Lynn talked about, we make sure everybody had, you know, in language flyers. I mean, I'm standing in front of the Xerox machine, you know, Xeroxing our in language, getting it all without money. That's all, you know, we're that's what we had to do. But now I think we need to invest in more of this across.
So going into that, because of the changing demographics, when we saw the census come out in 2010, we saw that there was the growth in Georgia, and that's why, we see that Georgia's become a battleground state. But we are also seeing the change in demographics in Texas and Arizona, as noted. So Lynn, you're in Texas. Tell us what's going on over there.
Could y'all tell that I'm here in Texas, or is that just, gotta rep Texas hard, gotta rep us hard. Because honestly, y'all, like 2020 was a hard year. It really was. If y'all, well, not only did we lose, and I say we because like I was working for the Biden campaign, did we lose the state to the Trump campaign? But if you examine it down ballot, it was challenging. It really was. But what was so unique, and I wanted to share this with everyone. So I'm here in Harris County, which is which is Houston and the greater part of Houston. Very, very diverse county, one of the most diverse in this entire country. But during early vote, right before Election Day, can y'all guess which surname was the most common surname to vote during that period? Out of all of Harris County, can anyone guess? You already know. Yes, it was Wynn. Wynn was the largest number of voters during early vote in person here in Harris County. And I found that was so remarkable because it went Wynn, and then it went Smith right after us, and then it was Williams right after. And that just really showcased, again, like the years of organizing, not just on the campaign side, but again, what the community advocates, what community leaders, and the years of advocating that we've been putting into this, and yet we're still in such a challenging spot. And I say this a lot here working in Texas, that we often look over to Georgia to see what they've built, right? And a lot of folks in Georgia have kind of asked me, like, what do y'all have in Texas? Is it very similar? And it's challenging because I think of the battleground states, Christine, and I'm thinking of the slides that you shared earlier, in that not only did we see a surge in AAPI voters, but we saw this surge in almost every single battleground state. Like that's like remarkable. And that is a reflection of years of this kind of work, and more diverse candidates choosing to run, right? That's the other barrier and the other factor that we have to also understand. And so the things are like, the landscape is shifting. And like Chantel, for you to say, going to Arizona for the first time and really understanding the dynamics there, like that's the kind of work that it takes, right? And like the last thing I want to say on this, because again, I just found this is just so interesting, is that some of the most fastest growing Asian populations in this country are going to be places that y'all don't immediately think of, right? So right now it's Fargo, North Dakota, that is seeing some of the largest surges in the Asian population, right? And again, like with these changes in the community fabric, you're going to see how that influences in politics and the way that we play politics. So again, it's you're thinking of like the changing demographics in southern states, thinking of changing demographics in the Midwest, like Christine, you're from Ohio. Like this is going to be some of the most interesting times that I'm personally very excited for the 2022 midterms. I really am.
So speaking of going back to like learning from Georgia, Vianti, what are some of the infrastructure things that need to happen? I always say that, they've had so much practice over the last 4 years, but what are the things that Texas needs to do, or Arizona, that can be learned from your experience?
Oh, Texas is in great hands with Lynn. They're in great hands.
And also, if you could talk about, like, since you also know about the C3 and the C4s and the campaigns also.
Yeah. So I think, so here's the thing, right? I have been in this cycle, right? From the 2016, 2017, the grassroots, right? Organizers, to, John Ossoff, right? Starting out there with like, just mobilizing. I wasn't working on just aid to Asian community then, right? It was on Cobb County. It was with the Stacey Abrams election that I got into, okay, I'm focusing on Asian voters, right? Because like Grace mentioned, that was the first campaign that really made it official. But that doesn't mean that that work wasn't happening, like everyone was saying. And I think what we see and what we're hearing, and everyone, you're going to hear this trend, is that the campaigns have a role, right? And the campaigns come in with a goal. And that goal is very single-minded. That goal is to win an election. It is to win a race. That's not community building. Community building and community organizing is what makes the fundamental long-term changes. And those changes come from our C3s, from our C4s, from our grassroots or community organizers. It happens in our local parties in high schools and churches and in our college dems. It happens where we gather, where we pray, where we socialize, right? And when campaigns come in, and it's important that as the campaigns come in, again, yeah, they're paying more attention to us because we're growing. We are now, like Sam Hart said, it's like we're no longer, we've moved from being just the marginalized to the margin of error, right? We are now significant to what campaigns are interested in winning. It's important that so it's like, let's be real about why we've become, an important demographic, right? They know we can't win without us either, any election. But the thing is that with this, the structure that's built, that is what, when campaigns come in, and what we really saw in 2020 that made a difference was, so I was the first AAPI director hired in the Senate race that was in the primary. And it wasn't until the runoff that other campaigns hired AAPI directors, that the party hired an AAPI director, right? So there was a lot of work that was being done that was not party related. It was not campaign related. It was being done by these on the ground organizations and teams and throngs of volunteers, right? And a lot of this that happens too is, yes, to win, but pressure, real pressure from the people on the ground. We can, where, because in states like Georgia, where we've built such a great base of organizers in the Asian community. And that's a beautiful thing about here. It's in all our Asian communities and we all work together, right? Which I think also makes it so beautiful and it makes us stronger. Is that we had this great base built, a lot of it was started with Grace, right? And the Stacey Abrams race. A lot of that was left just stayed and kept growing. And a lot of that too, it was the power in solidarity, in the grouping, in these organizations, that was so powerful that we were able to influence what these candidates did in Georgia, in making them see we are important and we are going to make the difference in this election. So you have to make us important parts of your campaign. So it is definitely, it's about building power, building long-term structure and strategy, it cannot happen. Like everything I say is like, you can't make decisions about anything or anyone if they're not at the table. And that's where we just have, finding our seats at the table. And I think that made a huge difference, like with having Lynn there and, and being able to have someone else that you could reach out to and knowing, yes. And so having people making decisions, and we need more. Like within the party, the candidate structure, we need more. Like I can count on one hand how many people on the campaign were Asian besides myself, right? And it's yes, because then you still have barriers. We don't just need, like Lynn was saying, we don't just need the constituency director. We need AAPI people in comms and in the field and in everywhere, because that's how, you do this. So yeah, cannot do it without the C3s, the C4s, the community.
Yeah, and I think as the community continues to grow and diversify, we've seen that we also have to pay attention to what specific ethnic communities are emerging in each of these different states. Because I would say the same infrastructure, the things that you brought up about being built in Georgia, that happened in Minnesota with the Hmong community early on. We also saw that in Utah, there's a growing Pacific Islander community, and they're getting politically involved. Oregon actually has the fastest growing Asian American Pacific Islander communities, actually coming from from our Native Hawaiians, right? And so paying attention to those details, and then with the growth of the infrastructure, we're going to see a growth of AAPI candidates and elected officials. So I want to go ahead and focus now on 2021 elections. There are local elections happening all across the country. It's so exciting to see that we also have mayoral candidates, not only Andrew Yang in New York, we have Michelle Wu in Boston and Aftab Purivo in Cincinnati. We have 5 days until the New York City primaries with a large number of AAPI candidates running for various municipal positions. And so, I want to ask Grace, now that you're in New York, any predictions on turnout and interest, and momentum gathering? What are we seeing in New York?
No, it's like another presidential campaign being in New York City. But it's like no one knows it. So sad. So Andrew Yang is a well-known AAPI mayoral candidate. There's another guy, Art Chang, who is also the other AAPI candidate that's running. So there are two mayoral candidates who are AAPI. Christine wanted me to definitely mention this, but for New York City, because it is a lot more left-leaning, all the candidates that are running for mayor as well as city council is they're all Democrats. And this is a primary. So early voting started last Saturday, and it's going until June 20th, and then election day is June 22nd. So I actually, yeah, my sticker is I voted early. And yeah, so I went to the polls today, and I was one of two people at the poll site. So they were saying Wednesday midday is kind of a less busy time. They said in the mornings, I guess, before people go out to commute. But honestly, when you talk to just like New Yorkers, people don't really know there's like a big campaign going on, a mayoral campaign in the city council. So I think some of the worry and some of the things that it's hard to predict of the outcome of this election is hinge on turnout. So will people really turn out on election day? Because they're not really turning out for early voting, even though we have 10 days of early voting. And now that we have ranked choice voting in New York City as of last year, a lot of people are kind of confused what that process is. So I did ranked choice voting for the first time really, and was ranking the mayoral candidates, and it was just like, how do I be strategic about my number 2 and 3? Because your number 2 and 3 could become the winner if the rank 1 does not get 50% of the votes. And with 8 candidates running in the mayoral race, no one's going to get 50% of the votes. So in terms of the questions I get asked a lot, because, you know, I'm an Asian American in New York City politics, is will Andrew Yang become the next mayor of New York City? My response is, it's very possible. It's very, very possible. So we may have our first Asian American mayor of New York City. We'll see what happens. I think it's just been really interesting also in a place as diverse as New York City. You know, you would think people, you know, would just be a little bit more open to embracing all diverse candidates, but you probably saw the really racist, I think it was New York Times cartoon that came out of Andrew Yang, coming out of the subway and portraying him as a foreigner, which is a very common and messed up stereotype of our community as being the perpetual foreigner, even though he is an American and he is just as American as any other candidate, but none of the other mayoral candidates even got that type of racist cartoon. It's just like, from what I understand from both Andrew Yang and Evelyn, his wife, is that they've received a number of threats and racist threats at being Asian American and Asians. And I think it's been really, really tough on them. So I have to say, anyone running for office, especially in a place like New York City, where the anti-Asian racism and violence has not stopped, it's so brave and courageous. So I give so much props to them. In my district, Sunnyside, Queens, District 26, my good friend Julie Wan is running. She's one of like 4 or 5 AAPI city council candidates for running. And so we may have just a really interesting change in our city council demographics. As of now, we only have 2 city council members who are Asian American, Peter Koo and Margaret Chin. And many of the city council members are terming out. There are about 23 open seats out of like 56. So there are a lot of AIs, and it's going to be really interesting in New York City. And I'm really excited about Michelle Wu. I won't speak to New York City as much on my personal thoughts on the mayoral race, because I think it's better to censor myself. But on the Boston race, I'm really, really hoping that Michelle wins. I love her. I think she's been so great as Boston City Council president, and her leadership from being city council member to where she is now. And she, you know, she was a former student of Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she's just a badass, amazing woman of integrity and like just a leader. So maybe we'll have a couple of Asian American mayors after this election cycle.
Well,
I
so
think I think the mayoral race in Boston, I talked to some folks in Boston that have been, you know, like generations of Bostonian, Irish Bostonian politics entrenched in Boston. They do feel that things are really trending Michelle's way. So I'm very excited about the possibility of Michelle, and I'm trying to figure out how to help her as well. So it's great.
So this actually goes into, how does one get involved? So Lynn, you know, can you talk a little bit about your trajectory in terms of how you got started? And then even Chantel, even though you had a career mostly in government, you've been like a super volunteer. So I want to go ahead and talk about how one gets involved, whether as a profession or as a super volunteer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to say first and foremost, I mean, everyone who is watching this event, watching this panel, y'all are like 10 steps ahead of where I was first starting out. But my start was actually more on the community organizing side. Actually, I did start in high school, but that was me like fulfilling my community service hours and my parents pushing me to go work on the local mayor's race. And I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand that talking to voters is actually organizing, but that's what I was doing. But my first paid gig was actually in college, and we were organizing for the divestment movement, applying pressure on colleges and universities to divest away from the fossil fuel industry. But more recently, and really more in staying in the AAPI engagement space, I've been thinking a lot on this, especially in the rise in anti-Asian violence, and that I truly have not been able to do my work and fulfill this role in the ways that I have been, if it weren't for the Black and brown women that I've organized alongside with. And like the one thing that, you know, I like, we really need to be honest with how this works internally on campaigns, and that I couldn't advocate for my budget. I couldn't advocate for the needs of how we do this outreach if I wasn't sitting alongside, you know, people of color who were also advocating for the same needs for their respective communities. And so the biggest thing that I've learned in like the last like 7-8 years of this kind of organizing is that, you know, take the time to really curate the people that you want to work with, curate the list of community organizers that you want to learn from. And I couldn't have done this work, and I'm thinking explicitly with Cory Booker's campaign, where, you know, I told my boss I did not want the title of AAPI outreach director. I can't be placed in that space exclusively. And so instead of hiring me in that role, you know, we had AAPI leadership in political and comms, in press, in the States, and in the first 4 states. And, you know, for the first time, I can't believe I'm saying this, but for the first time in 2020, I wasn't reporting to a white male, but I was reporting to this brilliant Black woman, you know, and that provided me with such a safe space for me to think, okay, if we're trying to honor this work for our own people, you know, I need to be able to openly share this with my boss. And so again, like I think of like how I started, but I really think of how I stayed in this space. So I really just couldn't have done it without, again, like the support and the solidarity with other people of color doing this work with us. Yeah, gotta be honest.
Yeah, wow, that's great, Lynn. I actually have an example of a young man. He's 18 years old, got accepted to Harvard undergrad, and decided to take a whole gap year to go work on political campaigns. And I met him in Savannah, actually. He showed up with purple hair. Is Indian American, and he says, I want to volunteer. And so he was on my team in Savannah. We went door knocking. He got a little bit sidetracked because he was in a car with somebody that tested positive with COVID. So we had to lock him in the hotel room for a few days. But he came after the Georgia Senate runoffs. He came to Washington for a couple of days, stayed at my place, and then he went off to New York. And he'd been in New York volunteering for the Andrew Yang campaign. And then when I met up with him this weekend, I was up there with the Georgia team. He's like a paid field organizer for Andrew Yang for Manhattan. So you know, it just takes that effort to go out there, be available, do whatever it takes. Xeroxing or licking envelopes. I guess they don't lick envelopes anymore. I'm dating myself. But yeah,
it's
just
all about texting, going tap, tap, tap,
oh,
tap, tap.
Yeah, there you go.
Great. So we're going to go ahead and answer some of the Q&A that has been submitted. So Vianti, could you speak more about They See Blue, and if there has been pushback from older South Asian generations, especially from South Asians who support Modi in the US?
Yeah, so the thing is with They See Blue, with Georgia, our chapter is part of a national organization, but we kind of beat our own drum. We dance to our own tune. We like set the pace. And the thing is, in Georgia, South Asians had always been, you know, in communities and elections, you have this idea, right, of how do people really feel? How do they vote? And it was generally a classification. Indians are going to vote Republican, Pakistanis are going to be Democrat. Oh, Bangladeshis, we know they show up and they are 85, 90% Democrat, right? And we had these ideas, but no one was, again, like organizing that in the communities. The Bangladeshis were, organized, Pakistanis a little bit, but there wasn't anyone looking at the whole picture. When we started, we really, it was a really great response. We had the people who were like, oh my God, there are more people like me. It was a home. It was a place where everyone could, say all the things you want to say that you couldn't say. And we are very, very particular about not engaging in politics from the subcontinent. We are Americans first. We are here to work on American politics. That's what we do. We have, and I saw the question was something about the older generation, right? We have members who are in their 70s all the way to high school kids, right? Yeah, there is a generational divide, but so much of that is education. It's having conversations. And that's what organizations like this does. It opens up conversations. It provides information in language. What we did, like in the last election cycle, we had a whole translation team that was translating things into almost every Indian and language you could think of. There are a lot of them, right? It's about that, connecting with people who, if it's in my language, I'm going to pay more attention to it. But overall, too, it's that we try to disconnect from that. Where we do run into a problem, honestly, like always, is that not all Modi supporters are Republicans or not. Right, that they run the gamut, and that's why it is very important to make that distinction and not let we all care about our homeland. I am from the Caribbean. I am West Indian, 4th generation Indian. So just so y'all know, but we all still care about home. All do. We care about what goes on there. But if we want to organize here, I think that's the thing. We've got to focus on what's best for us here and not bring those power dynamics that existed back home that don't really exist here, but yet we bring it into play. And so, yeah, it's something we deal with, but we've had a lot of success.
Well, speaking of immigrant voters, what are some ways that we can also mitigate the influx of dis and misinformation and propaganda, specifically those who are unfamiliar with social, economic, and political affairs within our communities and abroad? Lynn, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Oh man, I think after every election cycle, we always have some kind of debrief on this challenge, this topic, and it's frightening. Like I think of and this could be more anecdotal. I don't think it is, but I just think of all of our especially our elders, where English is limited, but just absorbing a lot of propaganda, absorbing information that they're seeing firsthand on Facebook, on YouTube, taken as truth. And this happens in my own family every single day. And so I still, and again, I'm going to speak more so on the Democratic side, because we've been having these conversations, and understanding what democratic apparatus we need to have in place. But, when we think of rapid response, we need to think culturally what that needs to look like. And not just with the Asian diaspora, but also with our brothers and sisters from the Latinx community as well. And one thing that, and again, the auntie knows this very well, in Georgia for the runoff election specifically, is that we were trying to find our online evangelists, those that can really carry our message confidently in spaces like WhatsApp. WeChat was a little more difficult. It's a much more insular space. But I think, and there's a couple of folks here that are watching that message that I know will know exactly what I'm talking about. But I really do believe that this Gen Z generation is really going to change the landscape. And I say that specifically because, again, they've just thought of like the most like creative ways, and I'm thinking specifically on TikTok and the ways that they're able to just share information. And there's one young individual, specifically in the Vietnamese community. Her name is Cookie. She's based in California. She's a recent graduate who started this online news aggregate website. And it's just simply meant to translate news articles in Viet, so that our elders can actually read articles and sort like trusted resources in language, right? And so she's now in the process of finding all these other like young community members who are willing to do this for their own communities in their own respective languages. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, wow, she's doing this, no resources. She's not getting funding for this, but this has been like her passion project coming out of college. So I think this is, it's scary, it's frightening, and it is really what hurts us in election cycles year after year. And I truly believe it's just going to get more violent. But I also think at the same time, we're seeing a lot of very organic ways that the younger generation are having these conversations in very difficult spaces. It is like the hardest conversation I've had recently has been addressing the anti-Blackness in my own family, within my mom and my dad, and the information that they're receiving. So I just have a lot of respect for young folks who are doing this, because they're doing it. I promise y'all, they're doing it.
Wonderful.
I think the WeChat space is really very challenging. We've been looking at this for a number of years now. There's a lot of misinformation. Who knows whether it's the government of China trying to infiltrate? I don't know, but definitely there's a lot of misinformation that goes on, and really, particularly around election cycles, that is very disturbing. And they go after, sometimes I remember they were going after Asian American candidates specifically. For them, I think they have been, used to be one single issue is I think admission into colleges, right? And everything is built around that issue. But now it's what we talked about, the home country problems that is spilling into our elections issues. So it's a head scratcher. We have to, like, many of us don't speak or write or read Chinese, and WeChat is just so voluminous in terms of misinformation that we have to figure out how to counter that.
So going back to in terms of how to get involved, what are some ways for ineligible voters to get involved on campaigns and politics? And that also segues into even with those who are coming from COFA territories, because those who are Pacific Islander, they have a special status. So they don't necessarily have the same access to also voting. So if you could maybe, I think Grace, if you could go ahead and talk about how you could get involved still.
Yeah. I mean, I have friends who have asked like how they can help out on campaigns as a non-US citizen, and you can text bank, phone bank, you can knock on doors, so canvas, and you can host gatherings with your friends to get people to volunteer or to do a meet and greet with a candidate. You're not allowed to donate if you're not a US citizen, but outside of that, and you can't vote. But you can mobilize your networks. You can, so it was interesting because back in 2012, when I was in the Obama campaign as a field organizer in Virginia, in Norfolk, near the area where there are a lot of Filipinos, there were Australians who kind of took a pause from their job to volunteer full time on the Obama campaign to learn how US elections work. So they did everything a super volunteer would do. except to like be able to vote on election day and to ask for money. So you can actually do a lot in terms of community organizing, whether it's nonpartisan through C3 or through a partisan campaign and join a candidate or a party, Democrat or Republican Party. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to engage.
Mhm. And I have one quick thing to add, if that's okay, Christine, to that.
Go for it.
I think what's so interesting, and I think we saw a lot of this during APA Heritage Month this past May, in that when we think of the Asian identity and the Asian diaspora specifically, is that the immigrant voices has just become such an anchor in how we understand how our communities move, right? And it's like that kind of storytelling and ensuring that their voices are part of this narrative is just going to be so much important. It's so much more influential in the ways that we engage. You know, whether you're on the C3 nonprofit side, whether you're on the political electoral side, and that's why. And I think again, it's hard when it just takes our country to extremes and tragedies for us to realize, oh my goodness, like who are we not including as part of this conversation? You know, and I think that's why, like, we're starting to see, and I hate that I'm saying starting, but it's again like the immigrant population and the new American population, or those who can't participate in certain ways. I feel like there's always ways for them to be part of this, that the onus is going to be on us on the campaign side, or those that work for organizations, to make sure we include them. There's, as Grace mentioned, so many ways to get involved.
One of the questions says NPR, New York Times mentioned that large percentage of API communities voted for Trump. How can we counter this? Does someone want to address this? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation around that subject as well.
I think what I remember from the data, and correct me if I'm wrong, Christine, because I know you've been tracking the data on this as well, and Lynn, is that actually the AAPI voters came out in droves for Biden and Harris. So I would love to see that article. If you could share that, that'd be great. But there's a great resource called API Data that Kartek and Janelle Wong lead, and they have been tracking a lot of the data points on API turnout and as it relates to the political parties. And every presidential election, more and more APIs have actually come out to vote for the Democrats. But within the API community, because we are so diverse, there are some differences. So I think I remember Janelle Wong presented on the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. There might have been actually more percentages of NHPI folks who voted for Trump over Biden. But by and large, for the other communities, it was for Biden and Harris. I think also it's going to be different within each state. So when you disaggregate, it's going to show different stories as well, which is what Lynn was pointing to, the storytelling, the qualitative data in addition to quantitative. But Christine, can you share more insights on that too? Because that's a misleading statement, I think, what was shared. The question.
So API Vote did work with API Data and Asian American Advancing Justice. So since 2012, we've been conducting our own national survey that's in language, because part of it is that we believe that we were not part of the narrative, and a lot of polls did not include APIs, especially surveying us in language. So what we have seen is that majority, including this round, it has shifted from the 90s, where Asian Americans were supporting Republicans, to now they're supporting Democrats. Even with the Biden campaign, majority of Asian American and Pacific Islanders did vote for Biden. But what I think what they're alluding to is that when you look over time, and even recently, we even reviewed back in terms of the trend data from starting at 2014 through 2020 of our own survey, is that slowly the Republicans are chipping away in terms of getting more Asian Americans to support the Republican ticket. And part of that is also because they started to invest dollars in terms of advertising and hiring AAPI staff members, versus if for those that know their history, for the Democrats, they've actually been doing that since 1991. And I think the Republicans started doing that in more like 2013, 2014, when Jeb Bush actually alluded to that. And so that's where you're starting to see that shift a little bit. But once again, it is right now majority Democrat. And there are a little bit of differences with the Vietnamese and the Filipinos being a little bit more conservative as well.
Yeah, and just a data point on Georgia, I remember from 2018 and in 2020, the Republicans, to Christine's point about investment into campaigns, they were hitting up all of our ethnic media channels and putting a lot of paid media campaign money into Korean, Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, all of the outlets, and then very, very strategic point by point of a breakdown of why to support the Republican slate of candidates. So I have to say, there are some things that Democrats can definitely learn from how Republicans are investing in the AAPI community. You know, like there's a lot we can learn from each other for sure, but I was, you know, I held my tongue back in 2020, but I was like, come on, party, let's get our act together. Let's put that money in, not the last couple of weeks of before election day, but months before, which is what the Republican Party has been doing. And honestly, they've been like kind of courting our voters like in the off cycle. Like they are very, very strategic, and we should be just as strategic. And I don't know who's all watching this, but this is just a plug for like, come on, everyone, Democrats and Republicans, like invest and be strategic as you are with any other community, women voters, LGBTQ voters.
So
Do the same with the AAPI community too. That's what I'm saying.
yeah, so we only have 5 more minutes. I just want to squeeze in these last 2 questions. And so maybe each of you, someone could figure out which one you want to lean in on this. One is, how have you all communicated and emphasized our recent presence of electoral power to the AANHPI community? And then the second question is, so there's been a lot of talk about Andrew Yang, since I assume he's one of the more prominent API candidates in the election field. I'm curious about how the panelists feel about how some of these current API candidates, especially Yang, are attempting to quote unquote represent the entire base. What do you think is the right approach for an API candidate to address API voters, given that our communities are so diverse, have such different priorities? Is Yang's blanket assimilationist approach effective?
I'll just make a quick comment on this. I know we're running out of time, but I do think, so talk about like in line with like what Grace said the Republicans have been doing. They've been putting Asians on their ticket, right? That's also something they've been doing. And we can't, when reference to someone like Yang or anyone else on a candidate, we have to look at their entire platform. We can't just go on, he looks like me or not. And we have to be, each party, as Democrats, you have to be careful, or each party, right? However you're voting, you look at that candidate, you have to make sure that they actually represent their values. And again, the API community, I agree, is so diverse, and we have our own issues. We have our own anti-Blackness in our communities that have to be addressed. We have our own, Asian communities that don't get along with each other and have their own prejudices. And we need to fix those things. And there's no one candidate that's going to do that. But when we have those candidates that are out there and they have fault, we also have to hold them accountable. And so I just want to say that no one is representing everyone. No one. We have to hold everybody accountable, regardless of what they look like, and hold ourselves accountable.
Wonderful, especially when you're also seeing that Asians are running against Asians too, right? So it really is about looking at the candidates in totality.
Yeah.
And anyone want to go ahead and answer the other question about how do we communicate more effectively about our electoral power that we've just gained, especially to the API community?
I think like just Lynn's point about storytelling is the best way to communicate this to our own community. So when I share data and stats, that's not gonna jive with my family members who are not involved in politics. Maybe other political people, like our friends here on the panel, we would get like really excited about the numbers because we're political nerds. But I think most people, it's gonna be storytelling. Um, Maybe blog posts, maybe also this webinar. I hope this webinar is educational. And since it's on Facebook live streaming, like sharing it with your family or talking about what some of your takeaways are. But honestly, your own personal story of like why you care, why you're doing this. Look at how much we've achieved from 2012 to 2016 to 2020. We have more to do in the upcoming, cycles. And talking about your own piece of it, it's gonna be the most effective way to like share how far communities come. Um, but I bet Lynn has some ideas also of like amazing storytellers who she'd recommend reading up on. But yeah, I mean, even like Asian American writers. So I just bought this book called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, and I'm excited to read it. But I hear it's about the AAPI experience and understanding it. So I think that is another way to get our community to have a better understanding of what we're in and how far we've come and how much more to do. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
Great.
Yeah, crying in HMAR, that was so good.
I think all of it is really about not just participating in stories about participating, but it's actually what with the power we do have, we are able to have the a seat at the table in terms of policy decisions and policy conversations that affect our communities on issues that it sort of like comes back. And so tying that storytelling to like you're exercising your political power and look at what we have been able to achieve and how well that's going to be translated to help our communities on issues that matter to us. I mean, particularly around the now the Stop Asian Hate or getting representation or whatever it is. So those has to be connected and tied.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I thank you to Vianti, Chantel, Grace, Lynn for joining us in this great conversation. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the CAPAL organizers. But before I do that, I'm also encouraging each and every one of you to share the resources to your friends and family in New York, get them out to go vote. For those who want to lean in and actually participate to volunteer, API Vote is looking for volunteers to help phone bank into New York City to make sure, just to have conversations with voters to ensure that they understand how to utilize ranked choice voting and be able to participate. I'll be putting in information in the chat room and I will now turn it over. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Christine, Chantal, Grace, Lynn, Vianti, for your thoughtful conversation this evening. Thank you to everybody for joining us today, and a big special thanks to Hannah for all of her work on the whole WLP series and all of the sessions. Before you log off, there are a few important pieces of information we'd like to mention. First, don't miss our upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we have our third WLP session, Self-Care as Community Care, AANHPI Mental Health and COVID-19, where we're going to talk about the effects of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic on the AANHPI community in terms of mental health and wellness. So key topics are going to include overcoming barriers to access to resources, addressing the mental health stigma that exists in the AANHPI community, and discussing ways in which to cope and support others. Please check out our website on how to register and view all our upcoming programming. You can visit our website on CAPAL.org, and we are also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We would like to take a moment to thank all of our 2021 sponsors for their continued support in our programs and for helping us to continue to provide opportunities for AANHPI in public service. Initially, CAPAL was an all-volunteer organization and served, and over time we have served more than 600 scholars and interns and awarded over $360,000 to support public service careers for both undergrads and graduate students. Our board members, scholars, and interns have gone on to serve as senior leaders across government, from executive, legislative, and judicial branches to federal, state, and local levels, as well as prominent policy and advocacy organizations. You just met many, I think, what is it, 5 or 6 of them today. Your valued financial contributions help expand this work. So to donate, visit CAPAL.org. We also asked that you spread the word about our scholarship and internship program. Opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students open every year in November. Please consider if there are any AANHPI students you know or organizations who may be interested, and tell your University Career Center about us. If your organization is interested in sponsoring us, contact our Managing Director, Shama Ahmed, for sponsorship opportunities. And finally, we are always trying to improve our programming to meet the needs and expectations of our community. There is a short survey linked in the chat, and it should take you no more than 2 to 3 minutes to complete. Your honest feedback will be extremely valuable to our future programming, and your contribution is so appreciated. Thank you all, and good night.